If someone had told me that helping my best friend move out would end with the two of us locked inside his empty apartment, I would have laughed. If they had told me that it would force us to say everything we had spent years pretending not to feel, I never would have believed them. 8 hours earlier, the rain hadn't seemed like anything more than another gray Seattle morning. It drummed softly against my windshield as I pulled into the cracked parking lot of Mason Reed's apartment building, balancing a cardboard tray with 2 large coffees in one hand and my keys in the other. The building looked exactly the way it always had. Old brick walls stained darker by years of rain and narrow windows that somehow managed to make every apartment feel smaller than it really was. I glanced up toward the 3rd floor where one window was already open despite the weather. That had to be Mason. He always insisted fresh air could fix anything, even when it was 48 degrees outside. By the time I reached his door, he had already swung it open before I could knock. "You're late," he said with the faintest grin. "By 3 whole minutes. I had to stop for coffee because somebody thinks moving 73 boxes counts as cardio." He took one of the cups from my hand without arguing. "It's only 68 now. You counted. I organized them." I stepped inside and immediately realized he wasn't joking. Every cardboard box was lined up with military precision across the nearly empty living room. Labels covered every side in thick black marker. Kitchen, books, winter clothes, tools. Even the cleaning supplies had their own box. The apartment barely looked like the place where we'd spent countless Friday nights watching terrible movies and ordering greasy takeout. The couch was gone. The shelves were empty. Only pale rectangles remained on the walls where framed pictures had once hung, like silent reminders that something important had already left before either of us noticed. "This place looks weird," I muttered. Mason took a slow sip of coffee. "Feels bigger. Feels lonely." The word slipped out before I could stop it. He looked at me for a second longer than usual, but simply nodded toward a stack of boxes. "Come on. The moving truck gets here after lunch." We fell into the familiar rhythm that had always made our friendship feel effortless. He lifted the heavy furniture while I taped boxes shut and complained dramatically about every trip down 3 flights of stairs. We argued over whether lamps should be packed upside down. We laughed when one box labeled fragile turned out to contain nothing but old sneakers. For a while, it almost felt like every other weekend we'd spent helping each other through life's inconveniences. Almost. Because every time I looked around the apartment, another piece of our history had disappeared. The guitar he'd never learned to play was gone. The ridiculous neon sign we'd won at an arcade years ago had vanished. Even the chipped mug I always used when I stayed over during movie marathons wasn't sitting beside the sink anymore. It felt less like helping someone move and more like watching someone quietly for a long moment. I simply stared at the box, convinced I had read the name wrong. There was no reason for Mason to have a box labeled with my name. Every other box fit neatly into the organized system he always created, but this one stood alone, almost hidden behind the bedroom door, as if he had intentionally kept it out of sight. "You planning to stand there all day?" Mason called from the hallway as he wrestled with an oversized floor lamp. I quickly looked away before he noticed what had caught my attention. "I was just wondering how someone owns this many extension cords." He laughed. "You say that now. Wait until you need one." We carried another load downstairs, making 2 more trips through the rain before the elevator unexpectedly stopped working again, forcing us to use the stairs. By the time we returned to the apartment, both of us were breathing harder than either of us wanted to admit. I dropped onto the bare hardwood floor with an exaggerated groan. "If I survive today, promise me you are never moving again." Mason leaned against the kitchen counter, smiling over the rim of his coffee cup. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether you volunteer next time." "Not a chance." "You always say that." "Because you always ask." His smile lingered for another second before he quietly looked away. That tiny moment should not have meant anything, yet somehow it did. We resumed packing, working almost without speaking. Years of friendship had created a comfortable silence between us. We did not need constant conversation to fill the room. Every now and then one of us would point toward another shelf or another drawer, and the other already understood. It had always been like that. Sometimes I wondered if knowing someone this well was a gift or the beginning of something far more dangerous. While clearing the top shelf of the hallway closet, I found an old photo album covered in a thin layer of dust. "You forgot this," I said, holding it up. Mason glanced over. "Open it." The first page held a picture from our freshman year of college. We looked impossibly young, standing outside the campus library after getting caught in one of Seattle's famous downpours. My hair was plastered across my forehead, and Mason looked completely miserable while I grinned at the camera like getting soaked had been the greatest adventure of my life. Another page showed us trying to assemble cheap furniture in our first shared apartment. The bookshelf leaned so badly that every book slid to one side, and we had laughed until midnight before finally giving up and ordering pizza instead. There was a movie ticket tucked between 2 pages from the first science fiction film we had watched together. Then came a faded concert wristband, a handwritten grocery list that somehow included nothing but frozen waffles and coffee, and a tiny receipt from a roadside diner during the road trip we almost abandoned because Mason insisted on following a paper map instead of using his phone. Every page carried another version of us that I had nearly forgotten. "You kept all of this?" I asked softly. "Some things are harder to throw away." His answer was casual, but something in his voice felt heavier than the words themselves. Before I could respond, another loose photograph slipped from the album and landed face down on the floor. I picked it up carefully. It was taken during my birthday 5 years earlier. Mason stood behind me with one hand resting lightly on my shoulder while I blew out the candles. Neither of us was looking at the camera. We were looking at each other. The expression on his face stopped me cold. It was quiet, almost impossible to notice unless someone looked closely, but there was unmistakable warmth in his eyes, the kind that lingered far longer than friendship usually allowed. I lifted my gaze toward him, ready to ask the question that had suddenly taken root in my mind. But before I could speak, his eyes shifted past me toward the bedroom, and for the first time all morning, genuine concern crossed his face. My heart sank before I even knew why. Mason followed my gaze toward the bedroom, then crossed the apartment faster than I had seen him move all day. He picked up the photo album from my hands with surprising care and slid the loose picture back between its pages before closing the cover. "That one almost did not survive the last move," he said with a quiet smile that felt carefully rehearsed. "Guess I should pack it before it falls apart." I nodded, pretending I had not noticed the tension in his shoulders. "Probably a good idea." He carried the album into the bedroom and placed it beside the mysterious box with my name written across the top. Before I could take another look, he pulled an old blanket over both of them. It was subtle, almost casual, but I noticed anyway. Whatever was inside that box mattered enough for him to hide it twice. I tried convincing myself it was none of my business. Friends respected each other's privacy. That was one of the reasons Mason and I had stayed close for nearly 8 years. We never pushed when the other person was not ready to talk. Still, curiosity has a way of growing louder every time you try to ignore it. To distract myself, I grabbed another stack of kitchen supplies and started wrapping dishes in newspaper. Mason joined me a minute later, acting like nothing unusual had happened. "Careful with that bowl," he said. "My grandmother gave it to me." "The same grandmother who thought I was your roommate because you forgot to mention we had separate bedrooms?" He laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. "She still asks about you every Christmas. Tell her I finally learned how to cook." "Did you?" "No, but she does not have to know that." We both laughed, and for a little while the strange feeling faded. Then, as we carried a small bookshelf toward the front door, my sneaker caught on the edge of a rolled-up rug. The shelf tilted awkwardly, and I lost my balance. "Liam." Mason reached me before I could react. One hand caught the side of the shelf while the other steadied my arm. The bookshelf landed safely against the wall with a soft thud instead of crashing onto the floor. We remained frozen for a heartbeat, standing much closer than either of us expected. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, but neither of us stepped away immediately. Rain tapped gently against the windows, filling the silence that suddenly felt much louder than before. I noticed tiny flecks of sawdust clinging to the sleeve of his gray sweatshirt. He noticed the strip of packing tape stuck to my wrist and smiled before peeling it away with careful fingers. "You attract tape like it is magnetic," he teased. "It is a gift. It is definitely something." Our eyes met, and for a brief second neither of us seemed interested in breaking the moment. Then an impatient knock echoed through the apartment door. We jumped apart almost instantly. "Moving truck," Mason said, clearing his throat. But when he opened the door, it was not the movers. Mrs. Donnelly from across the hall stood there holding a plate covered with aluminum foil. She had lived in the building longer than anyone could remember, and somehow knew every tenant's life story before they did. "I baked cookies for your road trip," she announced proudly before looking back and forth between us. Her smile grew wider. "It is about time the two of you finally found a place together." I nearly choked. "Oh no, that is not." Mason spoke at exactly the same moment. Actually, we both stopped, then stared at each other in complete confusion. Mrs. Donnelly laughed so hard she had to steady herself against the doorframe. "You two still finish each other's sentences. I have been telling everyone for years that you act like an old married couple." My face grew warm. I expected Mason to laugh it off the way he always did. Instead, he glanced at me with an expression I could not quite read before quietly accepting the plate of cookies. He never corrected her. Mrs. Donnelly wished Mason luck on his new job, reminded him to call his mother more often, and disappeared down the hallway humming to herself as if she had not just turned both of us into statues. The apartment door clicked shut, leaving behind another heavy silence. Mason placed the cookies on the kitchen counter without saying a word. She has always had quite an imagination. I finally managed. He looked down at the foil-covered plate for a moment before answering. Maybe. That single word lingered between us longer than it should have. Usually he would have laughed, made another joke, or rolled his eyes the way he always did whenever neighbors assumed we were dating. This time he simply walked toward the bedroom, grabbed another box, and carried it into the hallway. I stood there for several seconds wondering why his quiet response bothered me so much. Outside, the rain grew heavier, rattling against the windows with enough force to blur the entire city beyond the glass. We kept working through the afternoon, slowly reducing the apartment to little more than bare walls and scattered cleaning supplies. Every empty shelf made the rooms echo a little more. Every trip downstairs felt like another chapter quietly closing behind us. Around 3 o'clock, Mason checked his phone and frowned. The moving company just sent an update. They are running behind because of the storm. How long? Maybe 2 hours. Great. More time for me to complain about carrying your entire life. You volunteered. I was emotionally manipulated. A faint smile returned to his face. That sounds dramatic enough to be true. We decided to finish cleaning while we waited. Mason vacuumed the bedroom while I wiped down kitchen cabinets that somehow contained enough dust to build another apartment. By late afternoon, only a handful of items remained. A folded blanket, a toolbox, 2 backpacks, the mysterious box with my name, and the plate of cookies. Mrs. Donnelly insisted we take on the road. The weather outside continued to worsen. Thunder rolled somewhere over Elliott Bay, and flashes of lightning reflected against neighboring buildings. The lights flickered once, then steadied. That cannot be a good sign, I muttered. Seattle Power Grid. Mason replied. It survives on optimism. Another flicker. This time the lights stayed off. The apartment fell into sudden darkness except for the gray afternoon filtering through the rain-streaked windows. Well, I sighed, there goes your optimism. Mason pulled a flashlight from his backpack and switched it on. Prepared. Of course you are. We laughed softly, relieved the outage did not seem serious. Then Mason remembered the last load sitting just outside the apartment door. Give me a hand with those boxes before someone trips over them. He stepped into the hallway carrying the flashlight while I grabbed the toolbox. We stacked the remaining boxes neatly against the wall, working by the narrow beam of light. Just as I reached for the final backpack, a loud metallic slam echoed through the corridor. Both of us turned at the same time. The heavy fire door at the end of the hallway had automatically shut after the power failure. Mason frowned. That should not have. Before he finished speaking, another safety door near the stairwell closed with an equally heavy thud. We hurried back toward the apartment entrance, but as soon as we stepped inside to retrieve the last few things, the apartment door swung shut behind us with a sharp click. Mason immediately grabbed the handle and twisted it. Nothing happened. He tried again, harder this time. The handle refused to move. That is strange, he said quietly. I reached into my pocket for my phone before remembering I had left it charging in my car hours earlier. Mason checked his own phone. The screen stayed black. Battery is dead, he admitted. He looked toward the silent door once more before exhaling slowly. I think we have a problem. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The only sounds inside the apartment were the steady rain against the windows and the faint hum of the flashlight in Mason's hand. I walked over and tried the handle myself, pushing first, then pulling, then twisting it harder than I probably needed to. It did not move even an inch. Maybe it just jammed, I said, trying to sound more optimistic than I felt. Mason crouched beside the lock and examined it under the flashlight. The building installed automatic fire locks last year. They are supposed to release when the backup generator starts. And if the generator does not start? He looked up at me with the kind of expression that always appeared when he was solving a difficult problem. Calm, focused, patient. Then building maintenance has to reset everything manually. How long does that take? He glanced toward the dark hallway beyond the peephole. With this storm? Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow morning. I let out a long breath. You are telling me we are trapped in an empty apartment because of a power outage. That is the current situation. I liked the situation better an hour ago. He chuckled quietly. I figured you might. Instead of panicking, Mason immediately started making a list of what we still had. 2 bottles of water, half a box of crackers, Mrs. Donnelly's cookies, 1 flashlight with extra batteries, a portable camping lantern tucked inside his backpack, a folded blanket. I watched him line everything neatly across the kitchen counter like we were preparing for an expedition instead of waiting for someone to unlock a door. You really do prepare for everything. Not everything. Name one thing. He smiled without looking at me. Conversations that matter. The answer caught me completely off guard. Before I could ask what he meant, a loud crack of thunder rolled across the city, rattling the windows hard enough to make both of us glance outside. Rain poured down in thick sheets, turning the streets below into shimmering ribbons of reflected light. Cars moved slowly through standing water while distant emergency lights flashed somewhere beyond the intersection. Seattle had disappeared behind a curtain of gray. Looks like nobody is coming anytime soon, I said. Mason nodded. Probably not. We settled onto the hardwood floor in the living room, leaning against opposite walls with the lantern casting a warm circle of light between us. Without furniture, the apartment felt strangely unfamiliar, as if all the memories had been packed away with the boxes. Even our voices echoed differently now. I reached for one of Mrs. Donnelly's cookies and broke it in half. Emergency rations? Mason accepted the other piece with a grin. Officially. I hope she never finds out we called her chocolate chip cookie survival supplies. She would probably bake more. We laughed together, and for the first time since the lights had gone out, the apartment felt a little less intimidating. After a while, my eyes wandered toward the bedroom again. The blanket still covered the mysterious box with my name on it, but something had changed. A small dark stain was spreading across one corner of the cardboard. Mason, I said, pointing toward it. He followed my gaze just as another drop of water landed on the top of the box. We both looked up. A thin stream of rainwater had begun dripping steadily from the ceiling through a crack near the old window frame. No, Mason muttered, already crossing the room. He quickly moved the blanket aside, but the leak had reached the cardboard. The corner was becoming soft, the ink in my name beginning to blur. He hesitated, almost frozen, before trying to slide the box away from the leak. The bottom shifted unexpectedly, and several papers slipped through a gap in the wet cardboard onto the floor between us. One photograph landed face up in the lantern light. It was a picture of me, smiling at the camera, completely unaware that someone had been watching closely enough to capture a moment I never even remembered happening. The photograph rested between us in the warm glow of the lantern, and for a moment neither of us reached for it. I recognized it instantly, even though I had never seen it before. It had been taken during an autumn festival at the waterfront 3 years earlier. I was standing beside a food truck, laughing at something just outside the frame, holding a paper cup of hot cider with both hands because the wind had been freezing that afternoon. I remembered the day. I did not remember anyone taking my picture. Slowly, I bent down and picked it up. Behind it, more photographs had slipped free from the damaged box. One showed me asleep on the couch during one of our movie nights with a blanket pulled halfway over my shoulder. Another captured me reading on the balcony of my apartment while morning sunlight reflected off my coffee mug. There was even one from the charity marathon where I had volunteered at the registration table wearing a bright blue shirt that I had completely forgotten owning. None of them looked posed. None of them looked accidental either. They were quiet moments, ordinary moments, the kind only someone paying close attention would notice. I looked up at Mason. He was standing perfectly still, his hands resting on the edges of the damaged box, as though he had forgotten what he meant to do next. You took these? I asked softly. He closed his eyes for a brief second before answering. Yes. Why? His shoulders rose with a slow breath. Because they reminded me that there were good days. I waited, sensing there was more he was trying to say. The silence stretched between us until he finally sat down on the floor across from me. Open it, he said quietly, nodding toward the box. You were going to find out eventually. The cardboard had softened from the rain, making it easy to lift the lid. Inside were things that should not have meant much on their own, yet together they felt overwhelming. A faded ticket from the baseball game we almost missed because I insisted on stopping for tacos. A small keychain shaped like a lighthouse that I had complained about losing during a weekend trip to the Oregon coast. A birthday card I had written him years ago with a joke so terrible that I immediately regretted it after giving it to him. There was also a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in the same careful handwriting. I picked it up instinctively. You can read it, Mason said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never mailed it. I unfolded the pages carefully. The date at the top stopped me before I read another word. 3 years earlier. The first sentence was simple. Liam, there is something I have almost told you 100 times, and every single time I convinced myself that staying silent was safer than risking the best friendship I have ever had. My chest tightened. I continued reading. He wrote about wanting to tell me how much my presence had changed his life, how every ordinary day somehow became better whenever I was around, how he kept imagining futures that always seemed to include both of us. The letter ended without a confession, only one unfinished sentence. If there ever comes a day when you might feel the same. The word stopped there. No signature. No ending. I slowly lowered the paper and looked at him. Why did you never give this to me? Mason stared at the lantern between us instead of meeting my eyes. Because the night I planned to, I overheard you talking after Daniel's engagement party. I searched my memory until the evening returned. You said I was family. Mason continued quietly. You said you never wanted to do anything that could ruin what we already had. I thought that was your way of saying there would never be anything more. My heart sank. I remembered the conversation now. I had said those exact words. But not because I did not love him. I had said them because I already did. My mind replayed that night with painful clarity. Daniel had just announced his engagement. Everyone had been laughing, and someone asked why I had never dated anyone seriously. I remembered smiling, looking across the room until I found Mason talking with another group of friends. I had answered honestly. He is family. I would never do anything that might make me lose him. At the time I thought I was protecting the one relationship that mattered most to me. I never imagined those words had reached the person I was trying hardest to protect. Mason, I said quietly. You heard the first half of what I said. He frowned slightly. There was more. I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Daniel asked me if I had ever thought about telling someone how I felt. I said there was someone, but if I admitted it and they did not feel the same, I would lose my best friend. Then I said you were family because I could not imagine my life without you. His eyes slowly lifted too. Meet mine. I never heard that part. Because you walked away. The realization settled over both of us with astonishing weight. 3 years of distance had been built on a conversation neither of us had fully heard. We had each filled in the missing pieces with our own fears until those imagined answers felt more believable than the truth. Mason leaned back against the wall and let out a slow breath. I spent years convincing myself you were happier not knowing. I spent years wondering why every time I thought we were getting closer, you suddenly pulled away. Another quiet silence followed, but it felt different now. It was no longer empty. It was full of things finally beginning to make sense. Rain continued tapping against the windows while the lantern cast gentle shadows across the nearly empty apartment. The walls that had echoed all afternoon now seemed to hold every memory we had uncovered. After a long moment, Mason spoke again. Can I ask you something? Anything. 3 questions, actually. I smiled faintly. That sounds serious. It is. He folded his hands together as if organizing his thoughts. First, what made you stay all these years, even when you thought nothing would ever change? I answered without needing time to think. Because every ordinary day with you was still better than a future without you. He nodded slowly before asking the second question. What scared you the most? I looked down at the unfinished letter still resting in my hands. That one day you would meet someone else, move away, and I would have to pretend I was only happy for you. His expression softened in a way I had never seen before. Last question. He paused. If none of this had happened today, if the power had stayed on and the truck had arrived on time, would you ever have told me? I swallowed hard before answering. Probably not. He gave a small, understanding smile. Neither would I. We both laughed quietly, amazed by how stubborn fear could be. Then I looked at him and realized I had my own questions. Now it is my turn. He nodded. Go ahead. Why did you accept the job in Portland? His smile faded. He looked toward the rain-covered window before answering. Because staying here and pretending I only wanted your friendship was becoming harder every single day. I felt my chest tighten again. Then why leave now? He looked back at me, his voice calm but painfully honest. Because I thought distance might finally teach me how to let you go. The words settled over the room with a weight that neither of us could escape. Mason had not accepted the job because he wanted a new beginning. He had accepted it because he believed leaving me behind was the only way to stop loving me. I looked at him across the lantern light, wondering how two people who knew each other better than anyone else could have spent 3 years hiding behind the exact same fear. Do not do that, I said quietly. He frowned. Do what? Decide what my future should look like without asking me if I wanted to be part of yours. He lowered his eyes for a moment before standing up. Without saying another word, he walked back to the damaged box and reached inside. I watched him carefully remove a small metal key attached to a worn leather tag. He returned and placed it gently in my hand. I stared at it in confusion. This is not for the apartment in Portland, he said. There is no apartment in Portland yet. I looked up. What? I accepted the job, but I never signed a lease. My heart skipped. Then what is this? A studio. He smiled faintly. About 15 minutes from your apartment. I looked back at the key, unable to understand. You always talked about wanting your own art studio someday. A place where you could paint without moving canvases every time guests came over. You said the dream was impossible because rent kept going up. I slowly nodded. I remembered saying those words dozens of times. 3 months ago, I found a small space that needed work. I rented it. My voice barely worked. For yourself? He shook his head. For you. I could only stare at him. He continued before I could interrupt. I was going to give you the key after I left. I thought it would be easier that way. You could finally have the place you always wanted without feeling like you owed me anything. I felt tears gathering before I even realized it. You. We're going to leave the city and still build my dream before you went. He laughed softly, though his own eyes had become brighter. I never wanted you to give up your life for me, Liam. If there was ever going to be an us, I wanted it to happen because we both chose it. Not because one of us sacrificed everything. I closed my fingers around the key until the edges pressed gently into my palm. Every assumption I had made about him throughout the day quietly fell apart. I had thought he was running away from me. Instead, he had spent months trying to protect the future I had almost given up on. You really are impossible, I whispered. Probably. Do you know what the worst part is? He smiled cautiously. What? You still think you have to carry everything by yourself? He looked at me, surprised. I took one slow step forward. You decided to leave because you thought it would hurt me less. Another step. You rented a studio because you thought it would make my dreams easier. One more. You wrote a letter you never sent because you thought silence was kinder than honesty. I stopped only when we stood inches apart. You keep making decisions for both of us. His voice came out almost as a whisper. I was afraid. I know. I reached for his hand, giving him every chance to pull away if he wanted. He did not. His fingers wrapped around mine with quiet certainty. Then let us make one decision together, I said. For the first time since the storm had begun, the guarded expression I had known for years completely disappeared from his face. The smile that replaced it was small, genuine, and filled with relief so profound that it seemed to brighten the dark apartment more than the lantern ever could. A sharp metallic click echoed through the apartment just as dawn began washing the rain clouds with pale silver light. Mason and I both turned toward the front door. Someone rattled the handle from the hallway before a familiar voice called through the wood. Maintenance. Is anyone inside? Mason looked at me, and for the first time since yesterday morning, neither of us rushed to answer. We simply stood there, our hands still quietly intertwined, almost smiling, at the absurdity of how a single night had rewritten years of silence. Another knock came. Everything all right in there? Mason finally cleared his throat. Yes, we are fine. A few seconds later the lock released with a soft mechanical click, and the apartment doors slowly swung open. The hallway lights had returned, and one of the maintenance workers apologized repeatedly for the overnight power failure and malfunctioning fire locks. He explained that the storm had overloaded part of the emergency system, and several residents had been temporarily trapped inside their units. Mason thanked him politely while I gathered the scattered photographs and carefully placed the unfinished letter back inside the box. Before closing the lid, I added one more thing: the old movie ticket from our freshman year that had slipped from the photo album earlier. Mason noticed, but did not say anything. He only smiled. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The city looked freshly washed, the streets reflecting the early morning sunlight as though Seattle itself had decided to begin again. The moving truck arrived less than 20 minutes later. The driver apologized for the delay and immediately started loading the remaining boxes. We worked beside each other in comfortable silence, but this time everything felt different. Every glance carried understanding instead of uncertainty. Every smile arrived without hesitation. When the final box remained, I looked down at the one with my name written across the top. "This one stays with me," I said. Mason nodded. "It always belonged to you." We carried it together instead of letting the movers handle it. Once everything else had been loaded, we stood beside the truck while the driver secured the doors. Mason pulled his phone from his pocket after borrowing a charger from the driver. A few moments later, the screen lit up with missed calls and unread messages from his new employer. He looked at the notifications for several quiet seconds before locking the screen again. "You have a flight this afternoon," I reminded him. He nodded. "I know. I am not asking you to stay." "I know that too." I reached into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around the studio key. "And I am not asking you to give up your career." He smiled. "Good. Because I think we have spent enough years making decisions out of fear." He laughed softly. "Agreed." We stood there watching the morning traffic pass before I finally spoke the thought that had been growing ever since the apartment door opened. "How about this? You take the job. I open the studio. We stop assuming we know what the other person wants. We talk. We visit. We see where this leads instead of deciding it has already failed." Mason looked at me with the same quiet warmth I had seen hidden inside those photographs. "That sounds like the first smart plan either of us has made in years." 3 months later, I unlocked the door to a small brick studio filled with sunlight, fresh paint, and canvases leaning against newly finished walls. The pale rectangle where an old sign had once hung was now covered by my first completed painting in the space. It showed 2 friends sitting on the floor of an empty apartment surrounded by cardboard boxes while a lantern glowed between them. Just as I stepped back to admire it, the bell above the entrance rang. I turned and saw Mason standing there with a travel bag over one shoulder and the same quiet smile that had always made everywhere feel a little more like home. Some people think love begins with perfect timing. Ours began when everything went wrong, and a locked door finally gave us enough time to tell the truth.